cities where there are these wonderful cultures of decoration of public transport. And this is a wonderful, whimsical, but also scholarly book about that phenomena. And it's a great joy. So I recommend that to you. He's been the coordinator of the Teachers program, and I think before retiring was a lecturer in Indonesian language and things at the University of New South Wales. And he's known as a language teacher extraordinaire. And today he's speaking about his new book, To Remain Myself, which is a biography of his friend and colleague Onghokham, who died in 2007. And he was one of the intellectual giants of Indonesian studies in the New Order period. He was an iconoclastic figure who stood out as a historian of colonial Indonesia, but also as an explainer of contemporary Indonesian politics, history, and culture. And his works, his approach, defied the homogenizing and ideological accounts that were kind of de rigueur during the New Order. And so I just remember as a young scholar that you would leap upon anything that Ong published in Prisma or in Indonesian newspapers or in Tempo, because it would just give you an understanding that you wouldn't get anywhere else about what was happening in Indonesia. And he stood out also very much because he kept his Chinese name. And as I said, a voice that we sought out for a non-sanitized view of contemporary Indonesia. And I had the privilege of meeting him only once when somebody took me to his house. And I thought it was David, but maybe it was Pat Jim. Maybe it was Pat Lance Castles, who was my boss at the time. I can't remember. But I just remember going to this amazing house and finally, you can imagine my awe of finally meeting this amazing figure whose work I'd been reading for some time. So, so I think the way that David's written this book, it's both an intellectual and political history, but also a very personal view of a very interesting and complex character, but a very important figure. And I think it's a very important lens for us to understand the last sort of 50 or 60 years of Indonesia, as well as the insights that he's given us into colonial history. So with no further ado, David.
Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, I have to stand at a funny angle because of the Zoom. So I can't come out there. Thank you, Indonesian Study Group. Thank you, ANU, and thank you, Onghokham, for being such a colourful and interesting person and living such an interesting life. Now, I thought of starting by referring to the time when I was briefly a student at this university, 52 years ago, when I came to Canberra as a junior diplomat, or as technically called a baby dip. I enrolled in philosophy at this university, and I enrolled in car maintenance at the local TAFE. I will not say which was better taught, or which was of greater value to me in my later life. I draw a veil over this, but thank you very much, ANU. I also thought of starting by saying how this audience has driven me into a frenzy of nerves over the last week, because I think that there are people who are here who have known me for over 50 years, including Penny, who joined with me, and Louise, and John Monfries, and Tony Pratt. And then there are people who knew Ong, that's even more terrifying, for over 50 years, including Margot Lyons, who knew him when he was a student at Yale from 1968 to 75 doing his PhD, and Jim Fox, who knew him then. And then there's Tony Pratt sitting up the back, who was a terrific friend to Ong when he came out of jail after his nervous breakdown in 1966. Ong said of Tony and his wife, then Blanche Delpuget, they saved my life, because he was in a bad way after his mental breakdown and jailing, which I'll mention later. So those are my opening remarks, but I'd better really get on to Ong rather than myself. And I'd like to do three things in about 30 minutes, and that's try and introduce the complexity of his character and his life. And then talk about some of the aspects of that life that are of particular interest to us as Indonesianists. And to conclude by telling you some of the themes, the many themes he wrote about as an Indonesian historian and public intellectual. Does that seem okay? Yes. So Ong, thank you very much. So many aspects, this different sort of characters, so many biographies are serious works about serious people. This is not. He was deeply eccentric with, as Tony Pratt said, a maniacal cackle. He was the urban bohemian who roamed through Jakarta from press office to press office, university to university, and diplomatic reception to diplomatic reception. He was the super host, the hedonist host of parties and dinners. He was the habitué of embassy receptions where he gobbled raw beef, smoked salmon, and drank himself often into oblivion. One austere Australian ambassador once said, well, it wouldn't be Australia Day if there wasn't Onghokham getting pissed. He was a friend to many foreign scholars, many, and he was friend to, he has an international network of friends. He used his intelligence and his knowledge and his humor and his drive to do that early networking. He was a killer lecturer, and I remember that very well because I was in the same department at him as Reeve in Universitas Indonesia from 1984 to 88. He would, as he lectured in his eccentric manner, he would suddenly blaze into anger, usually if students had not done their required reading. And he'd slam a desk down, and the students would sit upright with lowered eyes, while he hurled the chalk at them. And when the chalk ran out, he hurled the dusters and anything else that was on the table. No, you couldn't get away with it these days. And he abused them. He shouted, "Bayi besar, big babies, gila gendeng edan crazy, daging kiloan lumps of meat." This wasn't very flattering to students who are proud of having made it to Indonesia's premier university, Universitas Indonesia. And when I was teaching alongside him in the history department, my hand itched towards the chalk and the duster, and I just wanted to hurl them at students like him, but I didn't think I would get away with it. But he got away with it. He was the professor who rode in a bus. In Indonesia, anyone dreams of getting out of the bus and into the car. He was a professor and he rode in the bus, openly reading the New York Times. He was the professor with the most unusual deconstructed house, built on traditional Javanese and particularly Balinese lines. And he was the professor who was famous for cooking, and he was Indonesian Chinese. So why is he of interest? I've tried to already say why he's quite interesting, but also his life from 1933 to 2007, you see, goes through such important periods of modern Indonesian history. He lived through the end of Dutch rule. He lived through the Japanese occupation as a precocious teenager. He lived through the revolution on the wrong side, as it were. You know, Indonesian Chinese who were hoping desperately for the return of the Dutch with whom they identified. He lived through the period of democracy in the 50s as he went to school and to university, and then the deep polarization of the 60s under guided democracy, one of the factors that led to his nervous breakdown and jailing in 66. Then he experienced the whole of the New Order and just the beginning of the Reformasi from 2000, because he had a stroke, a severe stroke in 2001, and the last 6 years of his life were rather tragic, confined to a wheelchair. So not only did he experience all these periods, and I think his experience of them is interesting, but he thought about them and he wrote about them. So you get a double dose with his experience of the history and then his writings about them. And as I say on the blurb at the back, he looked at events from a very particular angle because he was so much a multi-minority figure. This is Chinese, Indonesian Chinese, from a Dutch, pro-Dutch and the Dutch education. He's gay, he's alcoholic, he's pork eating, he's completely unreligious, he's a super hedonist, and yet he becomes a respected celebrity historian. So an unusual angle. Can I show? Oh yes, I should also talk about my luck with Ong, was that he wanted this biography to be different from other biographies. Indonesian biographies very rarely have the inner life. And they almost never deal with the sexuality of the person being written about. And because Ong knew all of this, he wrote about biography as well, he wanted his to be different and sort of first in Indonesia. So it is the first gay biography. And I hope it'll be denounced and burnt in pulpits and mosques from Aceh to Sabang through publicity, of course, not when I'm there. And his openness. He said to friends and servants in his family, tell David everything bad about him. They reeled back in shock and were immediately silent and said, oh, he's so good, he's too honest. I don't think it was a tactic, and he didn't try to interfere with the conclusions. He said, I'll tell you anything you like, and the conclusions are up to you. So I was very lucky to have this, be able to write this, what I think is for Indonesia, a new sort of biography, dealing with the inner life, the emotional life, the fears, the doubts, and the confusions. May I just show some slides? I can't move away much because of the Zoom. Here's the young man in 1954, full of optimism, in love with Indonesia, as opposed to his previous pro-Dutch family background, looking forward to being, thank you, a productive member of Indonesian society. Here's the typical picture of Ong as a columnist. That's from his byline in Kompas. He was, I didn't mention before, the historian who wrote for the press. Most historians at the time thought it was a sort of intellectual prostitution to write for the press. They thought it low level and temporary. It's quite different now. Indonesian historians can't get their faces in front of a television camera fast enough or in print. But then they shunned the sort of daily. But Ong wrote over 300 essays, articles, and so on. So he was the historian who wrote for the press. Ong is a columnist. Ong being interviewed. He could look pretty startling at times. Ong, the party animal. He was always at parties. And you could see why embassies, he was a darling of the embassies, because he knew Indonesian history and the impact of Dutch on colonialism. That was his key research topic and writing topic. And he knew modern politics, but during the day he went to 2 or 3 press offices. So he knew the stories the press couldn't print. So you can imagine how diplomats liked to have him there at receptions, this person who could link the past and the present and knew even the stories that weren't being printed. Ong and his network. This is Ong and Miriam Margolis. You know Miriam Margolis? There are many weighty books on Indonesian history. Not mine, but mine has a blurb by Miriam Margolis and another by Blanche Dalpuja. And if that isn't 2 cult figures, I don't know what you can get. Eat your heart out, other Indonesianists. Miriam and Blanche are with me. He became a great pal of Miriam Margolis. So she was famous, of course, from playing Professor Strout in Harry Potter. So I think this is the only Indonesian historical work written by a foreigner that is approved of and endorsed by the Harry Potter film franchise. With American scholars, particularly from Cornell University, he's Dan Lev, so famous, Ben Anderson, Melly Tan, very well-known writer on Indonesian Chinese and on women. Here he is with Pramudia Anantatur, the famous novelist, whom he became friends with after Pramudia came out of Buru Island. He was very close to a lot of Australians. Here he is with Herb and Betty and Herb Feith. here he is with a rather dubious bunch. That's me 25 years ago. And it occurs to me, I looked quite good 25 years ago. I realized the deterioration in the last 25 years has been pretty catastrophic. But anyway, so here's Ong and Robert Lee, whom some of you know, and me and Pat Suryo from the State University of Jogja. Here's Ong in the famous Men Who Can Cook competition, in which he organized by Femina magazine, in which to his rage he came second, losing to Peter C, a famous fashion designer, of whom he said he cheated. And here is the last year, so sad in the wheelchair. This person who loved to wander around the city, go everywhere, meet everyone, eat, drink. He just stuck in a wheelchair for the last 6 years of his life. And people in Jakarta are so busy, and he lived a fair way out, so many people forgot to go and visit him. So that's how the biography started. It was started to entertain him in his wheelchair. I went to see him in 2001, said, Ong, may I write your biography? And he said, I'd be honored. I thought, gee, that's great. So I arrived in Jakarta in 2002 to find there were 3 other people who had also been given the task. This was someone who was serious about having his biography written. But I was there and I had the time, so I had to take them by the hand and escort them gently but firmly to the periphery while I got on with the task. Of course, it's taken me ages to do it, but then other things came up. And then he died in 2007, so I couldn't entertain him anymore by asking him the questions, because you see, he'd had a severe stroke, and it's really hard getting oral history out of someone who's had a severe stroke. Can you imagine? Because he would try to overwrite this. I'd say, what's your mother's name? And he said, sorry, I didn't get that. I said, I'm sorry, I still haven't. It was humiliating for him. You can see, and I was so embarrassed and so that sort of thing, but it was still a pleasure to him, lots of ways, that someone was asking. And some days he was clear and some days he wasn't. And I thought, well, if I can't understand it, maybe it doesn't matter, or I'll find out from someone else. And I think that did happen in the end. So the lion in a cage, it's so sad, isn't it? Anyway. So if I just recall my thoughts of where I was going on to, I said in the second part, I talk about some of the aspects of his life, which I think are of particular interest to us as Indonesians. And there's the fact of his Chinese background, which he almost never talked about to me, though he apparently talked about it to other people. And he's what's called Peranakan Chinese, a Chinese from a family that had been in Indonesia for almost 250 years by the time he was born. And the Peranakan have adjusted into Indonesian society, forgotten their Chinese, and have created a new hybrid mix by marriage through an interaction with the local cultures. So Ong came from some of the greatest Chinese, virtually aristocratic grandee families of East Java. Great families built on trade, and from the mid-1850s, 1870s, particularly sugar. They were sugar barons and tea lords, and his great-great-grandfather was one of the most famous sugar barons, the famous Han Hu Tong. Look at him imposing. He was a guy. God. They had it all. It was gambling, women, money, great houses, expensive ornaments, statues imported from Italy and France. They lived in great mansions in these East Javanese towns. And Ong came from a minor sprig. He was from a poor, but he came from a background of this great wealth and social prestige. So startling that he later becomes an enthusiastic citizen of Indonesia. It's from what he left behind was so startling. That's his grandfather, that's his great-grandfather, Han Hu Tong, and his wife, Ik Nio. They drove around East Java. Look, driving around East Java in rich cars, status. They wore pigtails up till 1911, when there was a big controversy about cutting them off. Many didn't want to, partly because of loyalty to the Qing and partly because of being a tradition that they respected. This is the Han Hutong's son's, so Ong's grandfather, son's wedding, and you see there's Chinese there, there's senior Chinese still with pigtails, senior Dutch officials, Javanese dancers, Javanese aristocracy. This was a high life of the Peranakan. They were called the Packards. This is the Packard of the time. The Packard was the most expensive and luxurious sports car of the times. And these rich Chinese elite were referred to as the upper branch, Cabang Atas, or the Packards. So this is a Peranakan history, led to Ong's first strand in his writing about the history. He changed from being interested in the stories his mother told him to writing about the Chinese in the part of Chinese in Indonesian history, and then later in modern history, because you know the depth of some people here are Indonesians, the depth of anti-Chinese hostility in Indonesia and how deep it is as a continuing theme in Indonesian history. So I'm just mentioning the Chinese there. The other theme, as I've highlighted, is how Ong became startlingly the only historian of his time who became a figure of the press and a public intellectual through the press in that way. This started early in his career. He went to university in 1955 studying law because the senior Peranakan families like his could only imagine their sons studying medicine, business, or law. Girls, if they went to university, could study English literature. That was considered acceptable, but Ong started in law, but he hated it. He really wanted to be in history. And by about 1957, he'd more or less dropped out of university. But then there came along a Cornell sinologist, sociologist, Bill Skinner, who had written two famous books about the Chinese in Thailand early in the 50s, and then wanted to write another big book or books about the Chinese of Indonesia. So he was looking for research assistants, Meli Tan, whom we saw before, and Ong became his research assistants. This was the start of two themes in Ong's life: the theme of researching and writing about the Indonesian Chinese, and of being a great friend to foreign scholars, because the meeting with Skinner from Cornell led to meeting Dan Lev, and then the Feats, and Ben Anderson, Ruth McVeigh, and so Ong became Margot Lyons and became a friend of all the great Indonesian scholars of that generation. So Ong worked as a research assistant for Skinner for a year, and when Skinner went back, Ong started writing for a famous newspaper called Star Weekly, a Peranakan Chinese Indonesian newspaper, and started exactly the things he'd researched and written up for Skinner, he started writing about for Star Weekly. So that was the start of his career in the press, which went from 58 to 61 until Star Weekly was banned. And it laid the foundations for his later career in the press, starting again in 75, when he returned from his PhD study in America at Yale. So another theme that I should mention is his sexuality. Ong talks about it quite a lot in the book. It was very hard to be gay and Chinese, as you can imagine. He was his father's eldest son. He was supposed to carry on things, and in Indonesia, he became very keen. He became an enthusiastic convert to the idea of Indonesia in about 1953. There weren't any how could you be gay and a good Indonesian? There weren't any models. There wasn't anyone to talk to. There were no famous figures in history to follow. And so he wrestled with his sexuality right through the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And the way it's important here is that it was the deepening political tensions plus his deepening personal tensions of resolving his sexuality. He insisted to me that those two going together caused his mental breakdown at the beginning of 1966. So there's the terrible political tensions resulting in the terrible massacres of left-wingers, Soekarnoists and communists and so on at the end of 1965. And after seeing what this Indonesia project that he'd committed himself to had ended up in 65, in early 66, he suffered a mental breakdown and then went around in the streets shouting, "Long live the Communist Party," which was not a good idea since the Communist Party just lost the biggest. And so I think because of that, he was clearly weird. I mean, they were arresting people in the hundreds of thousands in the wake of 65 and 66. And Ong was, I think, if he shouted, "Long live the Communist Party" in the street, I mean, of course you'd arrest him, wouldn't you? You'd sort it out later, work it out later. And so his nervous breakdown, I think, led to his 6 months of jailing. And then he came out of jail in late 66. And as I said, was immediately taken up by Tony Pratt at the back, who often gave him lunches and dinners and introduced him to the diplomatic circuit, where he became a bit of a star in the New Zealand and Australian embassies in the late 60s. And then going to America, I think, was so good for a person like that. America was in so much turmoil, Vietnam and women's liberation and Black Panthers and Black Power and then gay liberation and so on. I think being at Yale at that time was a deeply liberating and empowering experience. I think his personal problems, which were so great in 65, 66, 67, withered away. And of course, gay liberation gave him new ideas about, and so it resolved both his political and sexual doubts. And so there's almost no gay history written in Indonesian, and I hope this is a good contribution. And Julia Surya Kusuma wrote a very kind review of my book. Julia Surya Kusuma is, of course, a famous feminist thinker and activist and a great intellect, by her own account, in Indonesia. And she wrote a very nice review of my Ong book, that she was spurred to write it by Queen Elizabeth's death. And the article was called "Two Dead Old Queens, Elizabeth and Ong." But the Jakarta Post couldn't come at that. And they removed the title and the references to Elizabeth, and Julia's screaming censorship called, yes, thank you very much, Julia. It's so good. Thank you. I'm so happy that you did that, and you, in an Indonesian newspaper, drew attention to these sort of dimensions of the book. Now, what I'd like to do is mention in the last 10 minutes some of the big themes of Ong's writing. And so the really big theme of his writing, this is his PhD on Madiun in East Java under the Dutch, and this is what established him as an expert on the great kingdoms of Java and the impact on them of Dutch colonialism. So it's basically about the period from about 1830 to 1910. And it gave him a knowledge and arguments about the way society was, in his view, being fairly largely dramatically reconstructed by the impact of Dutch colonial policies and their demands for land on which export crops should be grown. It also gave him ideas about the continuity of those sort of factors that led to Indonesia's modern history and politics. So he was one of the few people who saw modern politics in the light of the developments of the previous century. and wrote about them in the press in that way, and could in fact, because there were not, Indonesia had very few historians at this time. So on this thesis, only recently published by the Peter Carey's efforts, Ong was supposed to write it up as a book in Singapore, but he went to Singapore for a year and got bored. And I think he'd be lazy when there wasn't an editor or a thesis supervisor holding a whip over his head. And he never turned it into a book. So it was never published until 2018 through the efforts of Peter Carey. So it was not published until 11 years after his death. But what I think its role was, this great thesis on the kingdoms of East Java, was as a seedbed of ideas for his press career. So the ideas of his thesis came out in a different way in the short pieces he wrote for Indonesia's best newspapers, Kompas, the daily, Tempo, the weekly, and Prisma, the scholarly journal, and later for the Jakarta Post. So though he didn't get it published in his lifetime in Indonesian or in English, many of the ideas came out through his extensive writings. He wrote very prolifically because his salary wasn't high, but he needed money to give parties. And he loved giving parties. And his parties were terrific. He gave these wonderful dinners, 8 to a dozen people sitting around this wonderful house. You'd have drinks in this deconstructed Balinese set of pavilions. You'd say, where's the house? Where's the house? There's a bit there, and there's a kitchen over there, and there's a dining room over there, there's a toilet somewhere else. They weren't joined up. And guests would sometimes run panicking in the rain from, say, the veranda where they had drinks to where they were going to have the dinner. And you see, it would be Ong, consummate host, beautiful candles, best cutlery, and so on from that aristocratic Chinese side of his family, the earlier Peranakan part of his life. And he'd give these wonderful dinners. Drink would be flowing, and you see there'd be someone from the Indonesian press, maybe an ambassador, and maybe a visiting scholar from Japan and one from Holland. It was a dinner, but it was the best sort of seminar, as these ideas about Indonesian society from all sorts of different viewpoints and expertises roamed around the table. Ong didn't just write about the top level of the kingdoms, he wrote a lot about peasants. And he was famous for having a sympathy with the little people, the marginalized, the poor, and he wrote a great deal about the peasantry, both in history and in modern Indonesia, in his articles. So he was more an essayist than someone who wrote extended pieces. So his ideas were sort of just presented rather quickly. He wasn't someone whose ideas were developed to great length. One of his key ideas, and one of he was most proud of, was that peasant rebellion was a particular feature of late colonial Indies, and different scholars had different views on it. And his was that it was the core issue was tax on land, and the way the Dutch levied tax on landholders created a situation in which it was not the poorest peasants who you might think who rebelled, but it was the landowners who felt their power and their control, landholders, slipping away. And it was that group whom he called sort of yeoman farmers. It was the erosion of their power and their wealth that he saw as one of the key factors in the peasant rebellions, which characterized a lot of the Dutch East Indies from the 1850s to the early 1900s. And he saw those factors as leading into modern Indonesian politics. So he wrote about the kingdoms. He gave a very graphic picture of what it was like to live in a Javanese kingdom, all the strife and discord, factionalism and backbiting and so on that was happening in court circles. The degree of violence that existed from the court down to the village, and then a lot of strife in the village, quite opposed to the Dutch view and the romantic nationalist Indonesian view of the calm, harmonious, undifferentiated village. So he's a great writer on those sort of themes, on the Javanese kingdoms at the top and the bottom. He was also a writer, as I've told you, on the Indonesian Chinese, their history and their current state in Indonesia. He was a writer on the marginal people and the little people. And he also wrote about the figure of the Jago, a sort of brigand figure who Ong described as an ambivalent champion of the little people. The Jago was sometimes someone, this brigand who oppressed the peasants, but sometimes their protector in a Robin Hood or soldier-like way against the depredations from coming down from the courts in their demands for rice and for work. As I say, he's written on modern political history. He's written on sexuality. He was the first Indonesian historian to write about the history of sexuality in Indonesia. He did that because Julia Surya Kusuma, his great friend with these strong feminist interests, used to talk to him a lot. And she said she wrote a famous book called State Ibuism. State, the mother of the way the mother was creating was a figure created by the state to repress and control women. And that book of her famous work, she says, owed a lot to her discussions with Ong. So when in 1991 she was asked to edit a monthly, an edition of the monthly journal Prisma on sexuality, she immediately thought of Ong, and so he then wrote on history and sexuality. He wrote about food. He was the first Indonesian historian to write about food. He became an expert on tempe, bean curd, and on the rijsttafel, you know, the wonderful, great, vast feasts where the Dutch stuffed themselves with about 20, there's no one Dutch here, is there? 27, oh, I'm so sorry. The Dutch ate elegantly and nicely, stuffed themselves with piles of what Ong called an indiscriminate mishmash, a vulgar display. He said the Dutch at home, they're simple and Calvinistic and thrifty and restrained. And when they come out to the colonies, they wolf down. It was like they were possessing the colonies in eating these great indiscriminate mishmashes of food. So he saw that, as so often in his essays, he was interested in nation, in power and display, and how it worked through sexuality and food and all the sorts of things he wrote about. I'm nearly at the end now. He wrote about the Oedipus complex in Indonesian society. He thought Indonesian men were crippled by their Oedipus complexes. He wrote about how many of the Indonesian myths and legends are to do with betraying mothers, and mothers being left weeping and people turned into stone, or someone marries his mother and throws a great boat up and it becomes the mountain in Bandung. And he said, if you read Indonesian biography, you see they're all obsessed by their mothers. And he said Indonesian politics is basically run by mummy's boys. So that was another of his themes. He wrote about, I think I've still got a couple. He wrote about tuyul. Tuyul are Indonesian spirits. There are many important spirits in Java, aren't there, Sita, as you well know? And the tuyul is a little bald thieving spirit, which, see, if you lose a wallet in Java, you know a tuyul's got it. Or if you lost a jewel or something, a tuyul, people have stables of tuyuls that they send out to rob people around you. And Ong went to a tuyul conference, this is Ong a tuyul conference, and everyone there believed in tuyuls. It was a circus, boy, was it fun. We only read about it in the paper back in Jakarta. Oh, he's done it again. He's at a tuyul conference. Tuyuls reeked of village backwardness and superstition and all of these sorts of things. There's Ong giving a learned paper surrounded by parapsychologists and paranormals and all that stuff. There are people that say, I've got one here, I've got it, we're all finished, please photograph it. All blank. Another one made a wonderful speech about tuyuls have been misunderstood. They're actually mass tuyuls waiting to contribute to Indonesian economic development. And this one turned tuyuls from ignorant superstition into a force for pembangunan. Well, Ong was there. So you can imagine the paper's history department. I remember they said, he's done it again. He's in the press again. When will this man behave like a real mature historian. Why is he doing all these odd things? I remember a conference at a great hotel and all these Chinese business came in their Mercedes and all that sort of thing. And Ong came in a bemo at a little rundown old Indonesian public transport. There was he in this line of Rollses and Mercedes turning up in his characteristic way. Well, here he was arguing that the peasants' belief in tuyul reflected the illegitimacy of wealth, particularly southern wealth in Javanese society. And he made much of the idea that power and authority are generally thought to be right, I'm just trying to get the right word, legitimate in Javanese society, but that wealth is not. And so this became one of his most famous lectures as he lectured on the tuyul. Here's the tuyul conference with the cartoon of the journalists trying to photograph a tuyul, and Ong gave the tuyul talk, I remember once at Melbourne, where half the students thought he was nuts and the other half thought he was fabulous. And as he described this bald little tuyul, students' eyes sort of looked at this bald little Chinese. And Ong used to say, and Westerners too have their tuyul. His name is Marx. Oh well. Funnier when Ong said it, sorry. And then he also wrote about painting. This is a form of painting called Beautiful Indies, Moi Indi. These are so famous, these sort of paintings in Indonesia. They're still very popular. But Ong wrote about them as being a sort of a cultural project from the Dutch. The Dutch, like him, knew that most rebellions came from the village, but all the Dutch painting depicted the village as harmonious and peaceful and profitable. And Ong saw this painting as part of and an inspiration for the colonial project to keep the villages calm, harmonious, and profitable with force if needed. So he saw the threat of colonial power imposing this sort of form. And he said that, he went further, he said it was just a part of what he called the colonial sciences. So he said that the Dutch writing on economy was also part of this, the same, partly inspired by the Moi Indies, or the same sort of feelings, and Dutch writing, such famous Dutch writing on customary law, hukum adat, particularly people like Van Vollenhoven and Ter Haar, who wrote about customary law. And he thought that these ideas came down rather unexamined and unchallenged into the minds of Indonesian nationalism. And he thought that Sukarno was part of Sukarno, only part of him, but part of Sukarno was a romantic nationalist in the herited Moi Indi tradition. So he thought this Dutch, he went from these paintings through a discussion of the colonial project and the colonial sciences, as he called them, and how these had a great inheritance in modern day Indonesian romantic nationalism. So that was only one essay on, no one else wrote about painting. You know, historians did, I mean, painters did, but he was the only one there. I wish people knew that essay was better known, because it seems to me it has an intellectual breadth and depth and scope. So there I am at the end, ladies and gentlemen. I tried to give you something of a feel of the complex life, and then the aspects of his life which he experienced and he wrote about, and some of the major themes. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Onghokham.
David, and there are some of the book copies of the books for sale, but I can see they're practically all gone. But they're there for $34. And David has very kindly said that if you don't have the cash, you can leave your email and he'll send a tuyul to get it. But I probably shouldn't say this, but if you miss out, which I'm sure some of you will, it's also in stock at Asia Book Group. It's a little bit more expensive, but not much. So I'm sure everyone now will be very inspired to buy the book. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so now we've got lots of time for questions. Yes.
This is a very simple question, and the answer is the thing that's happening right in the book. So I will. Historically, the family name is passed down from grandparents to children, especially the male side. Was Ong born as Onghokham? And if it was, when and why it changed from Han family to Ong?
Thank you. There are some great Chinese families in East Java. The Han were the greatest, but then the Te, the Chua, then the next, the Tan. Ong's mother was a Han, it was from a Han married the Tan. Ong's mother came from both the Han and the Tan streams. So the father was Tan and her mother was a Han. That was Ong's mother. Now Ong's father was called Ong. Though in the family, you see, they all spoke Dutch. They ate Dutch, they ate ham. Ong's father was Klaas and his mother was Lies for Elizabeth, and his elder brother was Freddie, and his elder sister was Olga, and he was called Hans at home. So really they were all Dutch. They were just Dutch with Chinese faces. They did, their whole life was part of the Dutch strand. Now Ong's father married both the daughters. First of all, he married the younger daughter of the Han Tan family, but she died in the flu epidemic of 1917. So he was a widower. And then Ong's mother married this shiftless Chinese from Solo who had an aristocratic title, Setyo Diningrat. But he died early of a heart attack and she had 2 kids. So in the same family, you had a widow with 2 school-age kids and a widower, and everyone thought, you know what the solution to that is? And they didn't really like each other, and they were a very quarrelsome family later on. But in the family, there was this imperious old aunt, whom they called Kopo in the Chinese term, but behind her back, they called her the Dowager Empress. And she finally decreed what everyone was thinking and said, you marry you. And they were married, even though they didn't really like each other. And then Ong was born. So his family name, as you asked, was Ong. Onghokham, 3 words. Now in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a huge debate between the Indonesian Chinese as to whether to go for assimilation, which meant becoming really Indonesian, giving up Chinese ways and taking Indonesian names, which most people did, including Ida, who asked the question, and or others called, the others who, integrationists, and they wanted the Chinese to be recognized as a distinct group, an ethnic group like the Bataks or the Javanese. It says you could be a good Javanese and a good Indonesian, in theory. You could be a good Chinese and also be, so they weren't to be seen as antagonistic. So Ong was very much in the assimilationist camp. He was very active in it. He was one of the major spokespersons for it, though he was a young student of about 27. And most of the people in that movement changed their names. Now, Ong had been invited by another student to the Philippines. And in the Philippines, he saw that the Chinese were highly integrated there. And he saw that a lot of the Chinese in the Philippines, this is what Ong said, had taken the step of joining their 3 names into 1 name. And so that's what Ong did. He changed it from Onghokham, 3 words, into Onghokham. So he did change his name, as the assimilationists say, but he didn't change it very much, as the others said. So people said, did he Indonesianize his name or not? And my answer is, he Philippinized it. He went to the Philippines from January to July 1959, and during the great debate over assimilation versus integration, he changed it to Onghokham. But still throughout his life, his family called him Hans, and they all spoke in Dutch. when Ong was an old man and had his stroke, he still dreamed in Dutch. He told me.
Actually, we've got a question from Ellie, and then we've got one from online. So we'll take Ellie first.
Thanks, David. That was really fascinating. I was especially interested in the Reeve essay. I wondered whenabouts it was written. The rejection of Muyindichi is quite prominent among artists of the 50s, even 30s and 40s. So I'm just wondering whether Onghokham was interacting with the artists or whether he was looking at. I'm interested in the timing and the sort of social connections.
Thank you. Yes, Ong was a real collector, though he didn't have much money and he had to more look at things. But he started collecting books. He was a mad bookworm. And then he started collecting the masks of East Java. And he went to Bali in the late 50s and he started collecting Balinese paintings. That's what got him into paintings, because he knew foreigners and they knew painting, but they didn't know much about foreigners, and there weren't very many in the 60s. And Ong tended to introduce foreigners to painters in Bali, and they'd often give him paintings back in return. So he was able to amass quite a lot of paintings very cheaply. So, and painters were amongst his friends. He wasn't a major member of any painting circles or anything like that, but he did mingle socially amongst painters, but they were more people who would maybe come to his dinners or something rather than that he was at big painting discussions. So he loved fine objects. He loved going to Paris. He could spend 2 or 3 days in Paris just looking in the windows of antique shops. He couldn't afford to buy anything because he never had any money in his life, but he just loved beautiful objects, whether they were humans or architects or paintings or a spoon or an 18th century fork or something like that. So his love of fine, all those things included his love of painting. And he wrote that famous article or less famous than should be, 1994. So I've managed, it took so long to find almost everything that Ong ever wrote, and it's all listed chronologically in the back of the book.
How wonderful.
There's about 350 articles there.
We might take the online question.
Yeah, we've got actually quite a few questions from our online audience, but maybe we'll just start with the first one.
Yes, start with the first one.
So this one's from Jane Alstrand, and she says, "Hi, Pat David. Do you think Ong would be able to attain such celebrity status if he worked in the Indonesian context today? What emergent or residual factors do you think would enable or oppress him?"
Yes, thanks, Jane. Jane is the head of Indonesian at University of New England in Armidale. It was easier for him then because the other historians weren't rushing so much to get into the press. I think but he got into the press because he'd been lucky working for Skinner and then being able to write about that. So that was an accident in a way. He didn't set out to be a journalist. It was that he was a researcher for a Cornell sociologist, anthropologist, sinologist, and that led to him having a topic. So it led to him being asked to write articles for Star Weekly. I think with his basic intelligence, evil good humor, cackling good humor, networking, and unusualness, that he probably would have made today in the press, but it would have, as a celebrity historian, but it would be harder because there's more competition. But there's a great deal still about Ong on blogs and so on. The interest in him has continued after his death. There's still quite a lot. And he keeps appearing in novels. He's appeared, it seems, in 4 different novels since his death. So thank you. I think he would, but it would be harder. Is there another online?
There's one more online. And then we
Yeah. No, I haven't seen any hands yet, so we'll keep going through the online. So if there's anyone here, put your hand up and I'll cue you.
We have one question from Harisya Rizka Dharmawan. And the question is, thank you for the terrific presentation. In your book, you briefly mentioned the relationship between Ong and other historians such as Adrian and Sartono. Did you find any reference or is there any information about a relationship between Ong and Sujartmoko, one of the Indonesian intellectual giants?
Yes, Sujartmoko, who was certainly an intellectual giant of Indonesia and ambassador to Washington under Suharto, and who was the head of the UN University in Tokyo. He was one of Ong's mentors from the early 60s. And Ong says of that time, I was Sujartmoko's bag carrier, but in fact, he was a lot more than that. I spoke to Sujartmoko's widow, and she said Ong and Sujartmoko used to sit on the front veranda for hours, smoking like mad, swilling coffee and discussing everything under the sun. And so I said eagerly, what did they talk about? She said, oh, no one, just men out on the veranda smoking and yakking, and I had better things to do. So I didn't learn. Sujartmoko died in, I forget, the 80s, and I never learned what they talked about, but certainly there was a deep intellectual connection between Sujartmoko and Ong, and that could be researched further. Thank you for the question.
Next, we'll take another one online.
Okay, maybe last one online for now. From me, Ansel. Absent his wealthy background, could he have carried on in the same eccentric broad brush style? What was the role of his wealth or dynasty as a platform to criticize the same?
Yes, well, he never had any money. He was just very clever at earning just enough to keep going. He came from a poorer branch, a minor sprig of a great family. And there was a collapse in the international sugar market in 1923, which ruined a lot of great Peranakan families, the great sugar lords and barons. And they hadn't recovered from the 1923 sugar collapse price when the Great Depression came along, and that really solidified their poor status. So there were still a few very rich great Peranakan families, but not many. Most have had to make their own way in the newly independent Indonesia. So Ong knew of the great status, social status he came from in the past. But as I say, until I started writing this, he never talked about it. He talked about it to some other people, I found out later. But I'd never heard anything about all the great Peranakan families he came from. And in a way, that must have made it harder, I think, to accept the very low position people like his family had once Indonesia became independent, because they'd basically been rooting for the other side and only sort of reluctantly accepted Indonesia when it came along.
We got a question from the audience, or we go back to online?
Comments from people who knew him. Margot, would you like to say something?
There's so many stories of all. I mean, just as you know, I mean, it was so many things to so many people, and I just remember the joy of I fly to Jakarta frequently. This is in the 80s or whatever, and I used to stay with a certain person who had a more spacious house at the time, and often would turn up sometimes before I got there, and talk away, and then sometimes he'd end up spending the night at this person's house anyway because they had lots of room. So it was just so lovely to talk about all these kinds of things. The dukuns and tuyul, and the tuyul in 1999 was just a huge thing. And I remember talking to him about tuyul material that had come across in Central Java.
Question from me. Thank you.
David, thanks very much for that. Ong was clearly from the outside through his family background, his life. What do you think drew him to looking at Java history, very much, mainstay of Indonesian history? Do you think he was a good historian of Java?
There were so few of them. I think there were two, and he was certainly the second best.
Oh.
Well, the great one is Sartono Kartodirjo, who, so there was Sartono Kartodirjo in Jogja and Ong in Jakarta. And they were roughly the same age. And but Sartono was a Catholic. So all the early Indonesian history is written by outsiders. Sartono was a Catholic. Taufik Abdullah was a Minang. Adrian Lapians from the outer islands, as is R.J. Larissa. And Ong's Dutch educated irreligious Chinese. And they were the early historians of Indonesia. Now, Sartono had wanted to be a priest because he was a Catholic, but his father died suddenly and he had 2 younger sisters. So he had to work to keep them. This is related to the question. He had to work to keep them. So he became a teacher, not a priest. And this teaching history led him on to take a history degree at the University of Indonesia and then get the scholarships for foreign universities that led to him writing a great book on the present rebellions of Java, which he looked at from West Java. And then Ong, the way Ong became a historian was that he was always interested in the old houses of Han Hu Tong and so on in Pasuruan of his family. And his mother told him stories all through his life. And he was hearing these stories about the Han and the Chinese and how much they were linked in. When his mother went on tours to Java, she just didn't visit members of her extended family. She visited senior Javanese aristocracy. They'd been close in the past, you see, before the Dutch were thrusting them apart for their own ends. And so Java was a big part of his Chinese inheritance. Now, so he was collecting books, he was good at history at school, and then when he went to a Catholic high school in Surabaya to finish his high school. And he had there, this is the story we all know of, an inspiring teacher who changed my life. Most people have had this in their life. And for Ong, it was a Catholic priest called Brother Rosario. And Brother Rosario was who taught standard Dutch history. You know, they're all studying Dutch history, of course, the Zuiderzee and the great wars against the Spanish and so on. But he taught it in a fascinating way. And Brother Rosario set afire Ong's historical imagination and set him on the path to being a historian. It was also Brother Rosario who had so many Eurasians and Chinese and Dutch in his class who were wondering, in 52, they're wondering, where do I go? Do we stay in the Indies or do we go maybe to Brazil or back to China or America or Canada? And some of them did all of that. He taught strongly, he saw the dilemma his students were in, and he used to say to them, be a good citizen, be the best citizen you can of whatever country you end up in. And I think Brother Rosario was doubly inspirational in Ong's life. He ignited his historical imagination and he gave him that, because Ong then decided he wanted to be the best possible citizen he could in Indonesia. And he started collecting Indonesians and following Indonesian topics and buying in the bookstores books on Indonesian history, which were of course all in Dutch and written by Dutch people, like F.W. Stapel and so on. So when Ong came to start researching, it was for Skinner, it was on the history of the Chinese in Java. And it was a great theme of that, how intertwined they were with the great Javanese families. So I think when he was looking for a PhD topic, it was that had interested him in what things were like in Java. And local history was one of the hot topics in the late 60s when Ong was choosing a thesis topic, and his supervisor was Harry Bender, who also supervised Sartono's MA. The foreign universities played a huge role, and a few key people like Bender and Wertheim played such a role in creating that early generation of Indonesian historians. So Sartono, I mentioned again, because he had written a study of kingdoms and peasant rebellions from West Java, and Ong, coming from East Java and having a lot of materials he'd collected, thought I could do the same comparative thing from East Java, Madiun in East Java. The people were very keen on that, and established him and Sartono as the two great historians of the impact of late colonialism on Java. So his family history and experience led him really into being a historian of Java, and he didn't really write much about the others. though he often used them in his articles. He compared them with other kingdoms in other parts of Indonesia and in Thailand and Japan and China, and he often compared them with Europe. Now, how good was he? As I said, there really were only two. And Sartono was characterized by what he called a scholarly asceticism. And he was like, in his history, the priest he wanted to be. He spent most of his time studying scholarly, huge output. And while Ong was having parties and getting drunk, Sartono was publishing books. So there's no doubt, who was the more prodigious and greater scholar. But no one had that range of special new insights and so on that Ong had. It's a shame if Ong, as I say in the final paragraph, if only Ong had had the scholarly asceticism of Sartono, what great books he might have produced. But he did. He had a lot of fun. He admired Richard Cobb, the English historian of working classes and so on. And Richard Cobb was a very interesting person because he had bouts of riotous living combined also with scholarly output. If Ong could have been more like the scholar he admired, Richard Cobb of England, if it had only been more like Richard Cobb or Sartono, he might have produced some big books. But essentially, he was the essayist whose ideas are there in the press articles. Thank you.
Reeve, Will you ask him to say something? Yes.
Hi, David.
Hi.
I'm very ignorant of Ong's life, and I'm just trying to get a picture of the timeline. How long did he spend in America? You said that you described it as this really empowering and liberating experience. Was he there for a very long time? And then do you find it difficult when a person wants to transition back into life in Indonesia, especially considering how conservative and oppressive the early years of the order were?
Thank you. It took Ong was at school and university for about 21 years. It took him about 13 years of university to graduate. So this historian took 13 years to do his undergraduate degree. But then a lot was happening in his life and a lot was happening in Indonesian political life, like he was going to jail and having a nervous breakdown and things like that. So he went to America in 1968 when he was 35. He was at Yale University for 7 years, though part of that was spent in Holland working in the archives. He really worked hard then. So he had 7 years before he returned to Indonesia in 1975. Then he has about a quarter of a century as the senior academic and the celebrity historian, and then the host before his stroke in 2001. So I think the time in America was terribly important, and in Europe, as a time where it settled all these things that had been nagging and biting at him for the previous decades and set him up to come back. But people like Pramudia and others who'd been in jail under the new order, when they were finally released, they often just couldn't believe it. They couldn't, it was just so different from how it had been under Sukarno, and they hadn't had that much information. They hadn't experienced all the changes. And it was like stepping into another world. Ong had exactly that feeling. He said when he looked at Indonesian politics, he felt he'd stepped into a farce. He described it as a surreal world. He had doubts and confusions. He'd chosen to come back to Indonesia. He had other options. He thought he could get possibly jobs in America or Europe. But he chose to come back to Indonesia, as other Chinese were choosing to leave. So he did choose to come back. But I think it took 3 to 4 years before he felt happy and content in Indonesia again. And there were various factors in that. It was partly through he was becoming a celebrity through his writing in the press. And as he says, it's recorded in the book, sometimes film stars recognized him in the street. And he said, it's so embarrassing because I should be recognizing them, not them recognizing me. And of course, you're being recognized by film stars in the street. Well, that's pretty good, isn't it? And that's one reason he never felt that he had to turn his thesis into a publication, because he already had the status at the University of Indonesia, and he already had the status of being increasingly known through the press. And then he got his first Indonesian boyfriend he met in about 1978, and he's starting to have mature emotional relationships. So I think 78, 79 is about the time that he feels, despite the New Order government being so oppressive, he feels there's a future for him and he feels at home and he likes it.
Jim, and then one of
All right, well, David, I think Ong is really fortunate to have a biographer like you. I think you really caught the spirit of the man, and I really thank you for your presentation. A quick comment, I met Ong just after he had arrived at Yale. And at that time, I was a junior lecturer at Harvard, living in a tiny apartment with my wife, first child. And my brother was at Yale and studying in the same program, Southeast Asia program with Ong. And my brother called up and said, there's someone wants to come for a day, just needs a day at Harvard, has to do something. And I said, oh, well, come up, you can stay, you know, in our living room. And Ong arrived, introduced himself. And I said, well, we don't have anything else but a couch. So, but this is where you can stay, you're only going to stay a day. And he unpacked his bag in the middle of the living room and stayed on day after day after day. My wife did his laundry. And after a while, I think it was about 10 days to 2 weeks, we finally thought, oh, maybe you should get back to your program at Yale. And he did go back, but that was the beginning of our long friendship. Now, my question to you, and actually a very serious one. You've read everything that Ong has written. No one else has. You're the only one who's read. Could you go one step forward and make a collection of what you consider some of the best of Ong's essays in English and in Indonesian and put that out? Is that something is that a worthy project?
I think it is, yes. I'll suggest it to publishers in Indonesia.
Right? It'd be a wonderful, wonderful addition.
First of all, I got a research assistant and made him read it all because I thought I could write the biography and not do it myself. Because I was afraid I'd read it all and think it wasn't very good. But then eventually I did read it all and I thought it was pretty good. So yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the idea of that project. And I will suggest it to Kobam, the publishers in Indonesia, when I'm next there.
I'll give you, there's one very quick question from from Jane James. Are the slides, the photos in the slides, will they be in the book? And then a slightly longer question from Lady Hadiz, who's asking about the parties and the decadent lifestyle and wondering whether you could comment on whether this reflected the way that intellectuals of a dissident inclination coped with the New Order authoritarianism and its intellectually stifling culture.
Thank you. Yes, most of them, not all, but most of them are in the book. And a lot of pictures to do with Ong are online. You only have to dial them up and you see all people are still interested in him and talk about him and keep. There are many other photos as well. Most of these, but not all, are in the book. Yes, Vedi Hadiz I knew as a student when he'd occasionally come to my place for parties. So I'm not sure if he's reflecting on his personal experience. Yes, no one really knows why Ong drank so much. I don't know whether people had different theories. I mean, at the end, it was almost disgusting towards the end at times, the way he could get, slobbering and pouring at people and so on. And some people thought he was drinking because of a medical illness. Some people thought it was because of the death of his mother, because it really started in America because he had access to it for the first time and could purchase it, but not as much as later. But it was said, others thought perhaps it was because of difficulty of sleeping after seeing the massacres in East Java that helped precipitate his nervous breakdown and his jailing. So I can't ask about that, but I'm sure the general he was very much against authoritarian rule of any kind, whether it was the Dutch or the Suharto government, which he saw as being very like the last years of Dutch rule. So it may have been that his drinking style, Vedi, I know I'm speaking to Vedi, though you're having to nod. And yes, there are many factors, and I wish I knew more about why he drank so much. Thank you.
Oh, Chris.
David, you talked about Ong being caught up in the events of 1965 and going to jail. Engagement, involved in that. Did you write later on? Did you write about some of those events and how did he come out on the social and political context?
He wrote quite a lot, but in letters to friends. And you see, it was Dan Lev had written to him in 1962, asking for news on the political situation. And he used to write these long 4-folio, foolscap to 10 pages on the political situation, which he sent regularly to Dan Lev and to particularly Benedict Anderson at Cornell and to Herb Feith in Australia or at Cornell. So I was very lucky through John Monfries, who's here. Where is John? Oh, he's just, well, John I didn't think there were any letters. Ong was so disorganized. And these personal files, it's just like someone had taken a pitchfork and hoiked things in. I couldn't find anything at Ong's house. He didn't have anything. But then John Monfries saw, when he was doing the biography of the Sultan of Jogja, he saw in the Herb Feith papers some letters from Ong to Herb Feith. So I thought, who else has he written to? This was the first time I knew. Ong hadn't told me. It was hard for him to tell things. And so I contacted Dan Lev and Benedict Anderson, and they both very kindly allowed me to go there and take copies of his letters. So what I'm saying is that his letters from 62 to 67, writing to those scholars, are a terrific source of information, because Ong was going back and forth to Central Java and East Java all the time in those years. He wasn't a very diligent student at university. He would, when anything better turned up, he would be off. And he was in early 1965, Ruth McVeigh was going to East Java to Central Java on her research on the Communist Party branches. And he was always taking the scholars down there and back. And so he was actually there witnessing what was happening in rural Java in 64 and 65, and it filled him with terror. But he said, he thought it was, Herb Feith had discerned a move to the left at the national level in the capital, but Ong said what he saw in the regions was a shift to the right with a very violent form of Islam taking on the left. And he was fearing, as many people at the time, that there would be a civil war between the left and the right. So when it eventually happened, he like many, was shocked but not surprised, because people had been thinking about it. He did write after the fall of Suharto a couple of articles on those times, on 64, 65 and the coup, but it's the letters, of which I've reproduced quite a lot of bits in the book, that I think are the best resource on what was happening in politics from 63 to 66. Thank you.
Oh.
Just quickly, so following that, does he ever, did he ever do research on Kuan Legend?
Sorry?
Did he ever do research on Kuan Legend?
Not much. He was interested in Javanese beliefs. Here I mentioned Tuyul, but he's written a bit on the ways in which Suharto was a Javanese god king. But he didn't go much more in them than the sorts of things Benedict Anderson was already saying in The Idea of Power. So Ong was very much up on what his colleagues and friends were writing, Geertz and McVeigh and particularly Anthony Reeve and Benedict Anderson, and he would draw on their works, wanting through his writings to introduce them to a wider audience. So he didn't do much research after his PhD. that was the seedbed for his, he didn't do much research after 75. He wrote.
We've got another one, Ryan.
A question from Xiaoqi Lookman. Just out of curiosity, does David have anything interesting on Ong's view related to Gustor's tenure as president?
He hasn't written much about it. I think he was a friend of Gustor. They were both correspondents for the Tempo weekly magazine. And at one period, Abdul Rahman Wahid, who called Gustor, who became president, was also a columnist at Tempo. So they used to sit together in the Tempo offices in the 80s and I think the 90s. And Ong used to say, I do have a Muslim friend. Gustor, because people used to say he didn't have any. Of course, he did had a lot at university, but that Gustor was his Muslim friend. So I think he actually quite liked it. But you see, while Gustor was president, this is exactly the same, mostly the same time as when Ong was having his stroke. So there are other things on his mind. But I think he basically approved of Gustor, as so many people did, for his humanism and his moderate Islam and Sufism and so on.
Any more?
Tony, do you want to say what Ong was like in 66?
He was able to describe. I remember walking down the drive for the Imam Bondol, back in a pavilion. And he bring his cattle in. He'd bring things to sell. What? In various students. And what a great mystery and an entertainment.
Thank you. A mystery, an entertainment, and a wonder. Very good final words.
Yes, indeed. If there's no more questions, that's probably a wonderful place to finish. And don't forget, the books are on sale.
I also say, Ong did have psychological treatment after his mental breakdown, recommended to him by Sujat Moko. Sujat Moko asked another person, Kusumanto, another PSI intellectual. And as part of it, Ong wrote an account of his youth in English. That was part of his therapy. And I use it in the book, but I thought it was best to have a professional psychoanalyst and therapist look at it. So I'd just like to thank Glenda, who's sitting at the back, who read Ong's work and made many insightful comments on it, which I was able to use in the book. So thank you very much, Glenda, for your contribution to Ong.
Well, thank you, David, for a wonderful talk, and congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thank you. Sita, who made it all possible. Thank you to all the people on Zoom.
Yes. And is that a very similar, is that an old painting?